So our first speaker today is someone I had the chance to see speak at a conference last year, and she's fantastic. Her name is Radhika Dutt. She is the author of the book Radical Product Thinking. She is an advisor to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is pretty freaking cool. She's a consultant and a trainer. She's got a bachelor's and master's from MIT and speaks 9 languages. I encourage you to find her after this and test her and see if you speak one and she doesn't. She's here today to talk to us about product diseases, organizations that are doing everything right, but somehow also getting it very, very wrong. So please put your hands together and welcome Radhika to the stage.
Hello. It's great to be here today. What I really want to talk about more than diseases is how do we build world-changing products? How do we build great products that are successful? The problem is, so often these diseases get in the way. So we really have to avoid or prevent these diseases that are often fatal to great products. And true to the name radical, we are going to be talking about some radical things. And it turns out that we really need to challenge a lot of conventional wisdom so that we can avoid these product diseases. So let's get started. What have we learned so far about building great products? You know, the focus has been on these 3 mantras: fail fast, learn fast, move fast, break things. But above all, we've learned that you have to iterate quickly. And we've learned that if you do these 3 things just right, then you stand to build successful products that make lots of money. We've also learned that, innovation requires iterating and pivoting, and just iterate and pivot until you find this nirvana of customer delight and product market fit, right? The reality is, we really have to call bullshit on this. It really is high time. So here's why. I'm going to share with you some common product diseases. And let's do a checkup. Tell me if you've seen some of these product diseases. And the way that I want to share these product diseases with you, which, by the way, I have fallen for, and I'm sure it's going to resonate for you too, but the way I want to share these product diseases is in the context of the story of the Berlin-Brandenburg airport. Anyone hear of this ghost airport? Oh, just a couple of you. Okay, so let me tell you the story of the ghost airport. So this was actually supposed to open in 2011, but it didn't open until 9 years later in 2020. And when it finally opened, it was about $4 billion over budget. How did that happen? So I interviewed Martin Delius, who was a member of parliament, and he was the chairman of the investigative committee who looked at what went wrong. And Martin had actually read my article on product diseases, and he'd already started to diagnose all of these diseases in BER by the time he and I talked. So the first disease that he and I talked about was hero syndrome. Right? This happens when the focus is all on scale and impact. It's all about being big. And in fact, at BER, the way hero syndrome manifested itself was that BER's vision was filled with superlatives to be the biggest, most modern, the biggest and best airport, right? To put Berlin on the map. That was the goal. And what happens with hero syndrome, and by the way, for me, I had a startup, my first startup, in fact, our vision was revolutionizing wireless. And 25 years later, I still don't know what we meant. But it was all about being big, right? And that's what happened here at BER. So what happens when you have such a big vision? You think you have alignment because, hey, who's going to disagree with being the biggest, baddest airport, right? But when you have a vision like that, that's so big and broad, it masks all the misalignments that are lurking underneath. How many of us have seen hero syndrome? Wow, excellent, thank you for sharing. Okay, so what happened? One of the misalignments at BER that was masked by this hero syndrome was the fact that the architect hated shopping. So the architect designed an entire airport without shopping. To which the airport facility owners, they said, that doesn't work. Half our revenues come from retail, so we need retail. So then after the project had started, they went and built an entire floor for retail. That is pivotitis, right? Because pivotitis happens when we keep switching directions. When we keep switching directions and changing what we do, sometimes it looks like we're just going after the next shiny object. How many of us have experienced pivotitis? It feels like that is super common and painful, right? Okay, so they kept building onto BER once the product had started, once the project had started, right? And that led to this next product disease that I call obsessive sales disorder. I can hear this sounds familiar already. Obsessive sales disorder happens when we continuously trade off the long term in exchange for short-term gains. At BER, what this meant was, because the project budget kept ballooning, the team had to keep going back to the politicians and trying to get more funding. And every time they went back to the politicians, they had to promise the politicians something new, something new and shiny. Okay, we'll give you this. All we need is just a little more funding. Sounds familiar in sales, right? I mean, honestly, I've contributed to obsessive sales disorder in one of my early companies. It's when your salesperson comes to you and says, we can win this mega client if we just add this one custom feature. And pretty soon your entire roadmap is driven by everything that you have to make good on. How many of us have seen obsessive sales? Some of us with 2 hands. I love it. Okay. Then there's locked-in syndrome. At some point, it was clear, looking at BER, they said, you know what? It would be cheaper to just scrap this project and start over. But the cost kept ballooning, and the politicians said, guys, we have to keep going because we've already spent so much public money. Locked-in syndrome happens when we're so committed to a solution instead of really focusing on the problem. How many of us have seen locked-in syndrome? Thank you for sharing. Okay, and I'll share one last product disease, which is narcissist complex. This happens when we're so focused on our own needs and what we want instead of thinking about what is it that the customer wants. Right? At some point in this BER project, they decided to be the biggest, we have to double in capacity. But not only that, they also decided BER is going to be a major hub in all of Europe. Except actually, none of the airlines wanted BER to be a hub. Nobody was signing up for BER to be a hub. Narcissist complex happens when we build these features that we fall in love with, but they turn out that they're just not the features that our customers need. Anyone see narcissist complex? Excellent, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So what happens? Why do we fall prey to so many of these product diseases? What I've observed is that when we're iteration-led, meaning we focus on iterating quickly, our iterations continue to be driven by this need to try different things, but they're not driven by this clarity of vision and strategy. That's what we're missing. But we very often feel like, well, the whole point of lean and agile is that we take feedback along the way, right? Like we're supposed to just be able to start driving. Lean and agile gives us this fast car. The problem with lean and agile is, yes, that's true. Lean and Agile does give us this fast car, and it's wonderful to have a McLaren, but it doesn't tell you where you need to go. It doesn't tell you where you need to go. And to this, though, to this point of it doesn't tell you where to go, I often hear, okay, well then, we'll just use Lean and Agile and we'll iterate based on customer feedback. Customer feedback is going to tell us where to go, right? But here lies the problem. Customer feedback is like, when you're sitting in your car, it's like stopping and asking for directions. It's important to stop and ask for directions. But if you just step back for a moment, what you realize is that you are in the driver's seat. Right? And before you get into your fast car and start driving, or before you ask someone for directions, you have to know roughly where you want to go and how you're going to get there. Without that, customer feedback isn't really useful. Right? We can't really ask our customers what they want unless we know where we're going. Because you could end up in Montreal, you could end up in Florida. What happens is that Lean and Agile, as I said, they give us speed, and they're important feedback methodologies, but when you just have speed, speed can look like this, where everyone is moving fast. It's great, everyone's moving fast, but it's in different directions. And so what we want is not speed, because that's what manifests in these product diseases. What we really want is we want speed plus direction, right? Because we know from our high school physics that what we want is not speed, we care about velocity. And forward velocity, right? Where if you think about everyone in your organization as this arrow, instead of everyone pointing in different directions, what you really want is everyone pointing in the same direction. That's how we get forward velocity. This is where radical product thinking comes in. It's a methodology for building world-changing products, and it gives organizations a step-by-step process for building world-changing products. And it's a book that came out in 2021. And in the radical product thinking way, you can engineer your change systematically by having this clarity of vision, translating it into a detailed strategy, meaning an action plan, and then into a set of priorities where you're balancing the long term against the short term, so you avoid obsessive sales disorder. And then translating it into execution and measurement. What I really mean by that is translating it into hypotheses, and how will you test those hypotheses through metrics. And then finally, you can translate all of this into also a culture, the culture that your team needs, so that you can innovate better. And in the radical product thinking way, all of these are tools so that you can bring your entire team with you on this journey, so that you can communicate with your team and keep this alignment over time. Now at this point, right, you've heard me say all of these words like vision, strategy, etc. But then, it's fair to say, wait a minute, I've heard these words before. Of course we need a vision. I know we need a vision. So how is this radical? So let's actually look at a vision and talk about how a radical vision is different. But first, I want to do this exercise in this group. Let's do this exercise. Let's look at what is wrong with current vision statements. Why do we need a different vision? Because here's an example of a vision statement of a public company, actually. It says, contributing to human progress by empowering people to express themselves. This is exactly the sort of vision statement we've heard is a good vision, right? It's inspiring, it's short, it can last forever, it's aspirational. This is all the conventional wisdom we've learned. So let's do an exercise to see what's wrong with this vision. The problem with this vision is that it describes a lot of things. It describes a lot of different types of products. So think about a product right now that could fit under this vision. And I don't want the right answer. If you know the right answer, hold that thought. I want you to get creative, go wild for me. Think about think about crazy ideas that could fall under this vision statement. And since I'm asking the question, I'll give you an example. My kids have a piano teacher who is contributing to human progress by empowering people to express themselves. So this could absolutely be the vision statement for my kids' piano teacher. This could be the vision statement of a fashion company that is empowering people to express themselves. Any other thoughts from the audience? Anyone want to yell out loud? Go ahead.
TikTok.
TikTok, absolutely. Cosmetics, yes.
Duolingo.
What was that? Duolingo too, exactly. Okay, one more. Crayola, love it. Love it. Okay, so here's the thing. All the way from Crayola to Duolingo to fashion, right? Anything goes when you have a vision this broad. And therein lies the problem. This sort of a vision no longer acts like a filter. I should be able to hold up a feature against my vision statement and say, should I do this or not? And sometimes the answer should be, no, don't do it. Right? And this is why we have to forget all that we've learned. This is why we have to forget all that we've learned about what is a good vision. Instead, we have to realize that a good vision has to articulate whose problem are we trying to solve? And it can't be everyone's. What exactly is their problem? And how are they solving it today? Why does the world need changing? Because honestly, maybe it doesn't need changing, it's just fine. Then you can ask the question, when will you know that you've arrived? Meaning, what does the end state look like? And then finally, this is finally when you get to talk about your product, the how. When you can say, how are you going to bring this about? Okay, now that we know we have to answer the who, what, why, when, and how questions, okay, if you want to start with a blank sheet of paper, well, here's the danger. I've done that. And what happens is, you walk into a room, you start your visioning session on this blank sheet of paper, and you come out with something that sounds exactly like your original vision. Why? Because you focus on the words. You want to find the perfect words that are good enough to pollute this sheet of paper, right? How many of us have had that experience of a visioning session? Okay, great, thank you for sharing that. And so that's why we came up with the Radical Vision Worksheet. So this is a fill-in-the-blank statement, and you can use this to be able to create your vision that is really detailed. So I'm going to give you an example. This is the vision statement of a company I'd started in 2011 and sold it in 2014. Today, when amateur wine drinkers want to find wines that they're likely to like, they have to find attractive-looking wine labels or find wines that are on sale. This is unacceptable because it leads to so many disappointments, and it's hard to learn about wine in this way. We envision a world where finding wines you like is as easy as finding movies you like on Netflix. We're bringing about this world through a recommendations algorithm that matches wines to your taste and an operational setup that delivers these wines to your door. Now notice that I hadn't told you anything about my startup, and yet when I gave you this radical vision statement, you knew exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it. So that's what makes it a radical vision. Think of this as the source code of your vision, because this is what your team needs. And then your marketing team can take this and make a clean build of it, and that's what you put on your website. But this vision, this is what your team needs. And by the way, if you want to take a radical product thinking course, there is a free course on this and we co-created this with Pendo and Mind the Product, so you can get this URL, get this QR code. And I'll also share the Radical Product Thinking certification at the end of this presentation, and you can get a QR code for that. Okay, now that we've talked about a radical vision statement and how that's very different, what I want to share with you is how the entire framework comes together to help you build radical products. And the example that I want to use is one that I find truly meaningful. When I was writing the book, it was such a pleasure to interview the president of this organization. It's the organization that's behind papadums. Anyone try papadums, which are these lentil crackers you get in Indian restaurants? Okay, good. Oh, and some of you are from India, so you'll know about this story, maybe. I didn't know about it until just a few years ago, even though I grew up watching ads on this organization. Even if you've tried legit papadums or you've lived in India, the thing is there are very few people know about the story that the majority of papadums are made by this one organization, Legit, that has more than 60% market share. Right? And they have over $220 million in annual revenues. But what is most fascinating about this organization is that it's owned by 45,000 women who are all equal partners in this organization. So how did this happen? The story behind Legit is really beautiful. It was started in 1959 by 7 women. These 7 women, they really wanted to earn a dignified living for themselves. The problem was that they didn't have education. They were illiterate, and so their job prospects were slim. And they were living in a patriarchy, and they really wanted to contribute to household income so that they could educate their kids. But given that their job prospects were slim, they didn't have the ability to go out and get a job. So what did they do? They felt like their only skill that they had was to was cooking. And making papadums actually is really hard. You know, it's a labor of love. And in fact, my grandmother knew how to make papadums. My mom doesn't know how to make them, and I definitely don't. And so these 7 women decided to make papadums and sell them to stores. And they decided that whatever they got, whether it's a profit or a loss, they would split that amongst themselves, and they would never, ever take charity. So these 7 women started out by rolling these papadums on the terrace. And soon, these 7 women turned into 25. And by the end of the year, there were 300 women, and they no longer fit on the building's terrace. Today, Legit has over 45,000 women, and they have this big operation where there are buses that drive women from various pickup centers to, or pickup locations to these centers to pick up dough. They then take it back home, roll the dough. The next day, they come back and they drop off the papadums that they've rolled, and they get paid for those papadums. And they pick up the new dough to be able to start the cycle all over again. What is amazing to me, right, is when I interviewed the president of Legit, she shared Legit's vision, and it wasn't in the form of a tagline or a slogan. It was truly heartfelt. And so when she shared her vision, you know, I was able to write it down in a vision statement. And she thought about the vision for Legit, and she thought about the product as a mechanism for change. This is really the radical product thinking philosophy, where you think about your product as a mechanism for change. And the change that Legit envisioned was creating financial independence for women by giving them a dignified living. And the product was papadums, meaning papadums was just a mechanism for creating this change. So when you think about your product is not just software, it's not just hardware. Your product could even be change management, maybe, in your organization. It can be freelancing. You could be doing research, and that's your product, and that's the mechanism through which you're creating change. Even activism can be your product. When you think in this way, anything is your product if it's your mechanism for creating change. Legit had a radical vision. It wasn't a slogan, as I mentioned. So here's the vision statement that I was able to write down in this format. Today, when women without education from poor households want to run the household and educate their kids, they have to depend on their husband's income, and they can't influence household spending. This is unacceptable because it limits their children's educational prospects, and it repeats the cycle of poverty. This is, we envision a world where women become self-reliant and it leads to their socioeconomic progress. We're bringing about this world through high-quality papadums and later other fast-moving goods without ever taking charity. So this was their radical vision. But now you know, looking at the radical product thinking framework, that your vision is only the first step in being able to create change. What you need next is a really detailed strategy. And in the radical product thinking way, you write a radical strategy, which is RDCL. And the mnemonic there, RDCL, starts with thinking about what is the real pain point? Meaning, why does someone come to your product? What's the pain that makes them come to your product? Right? In this case, these women, they had a high work ethic, but they didn't have the education. The second pain point was that they were primary caregivers in a patriarchy, which meant that they had kids at home or parents to look after, and they couldn't leave home for very long. So this was the pain point. And so looking at design, this is where you ask, what does the solution look like? And in this case, the solution was that their model meant, let's make sure these women can work at home. So this is why Lijjat's model is about rolling papadums at home. Can you imagine if they had to work in factories, this model would have never worked. In Lijjat's solution, right, the design, they earn daily wages. Why? Because if you want these women to be able to influence household spending, they need to be able to have wages every day so that they can go back home and influence spending. It can't be at the end of the month. So let's now look at capabilities. How did they power this solution? One of the examples of powering this solution in terms of, if you think back to the design, I mentioned that they split the profits equally amongst themselves. Can you imagine 45,000 lawyers, irrespective of seniority, saying that, yes, we'll split profits amongst ourselves? It just wouldn't be possible, right? So in terms of capabilities, what they had to make sure of was that these women had the mindset that we're all going to split these profits equally. So as long as each woman rolls 5 kilos of dough every day, regardless of seniority, regardless how many years you've been there, we split profits equally. They had to cultivate this mindset, and they did that by making sure that these women recognized the importance of maximizing group earnings, not the individual earnings. There's a Lijjat pledge, for example, that all these women sign up for when they join the organization. And then finally, in terms of logistics, I mentioned that these women earn daily wages. Well, one of the elements of their strategy that enables this is this logistics and their business model. Lijjat doesn't give or take credit. Why? So that they're able to pay daily wages, so that they have this cash flow. To this day, they don't give or take credit. Another element of logistics was the training that they had to give these women, the mindset that they had to, again, instill. Think about the fact that these women are all rolling papadums at home. And yet, if you're from India, you know that Lijjat is known for its quality. That if you have to go buy papadums, you go buy Lijjat, right? And that's because they created this mindset in women and gave them training so that every woman is always looking out for the quality of the papadums that they're producing. And at every stage, they're keeping a lookout for this quality so that bad papadums never make it through their supply chain. So this was their strategy. Okay, so now that we've talked about vision and strategy, let's talk about priorities and how do you translate this vision and strategy into a set of priorities? Now, prioritization is where you take into account the problem of survival. This is where you have to think about the yin and yang of long-term versus short-term, right? A good product finds the right balance between this yin and yang. And in the radical product thinking way, you make this yin and yang really explicit for your team so that they can visually see how you're prioritizing the long term against the short term. So let's look at a few examples of how they did this at Lidget. They started by taking a loan so that they could buy the equipment that they needed to be able to make these puppetums, right? This was this feature of taking a loan was good for survival, but it wasn't good for the long-term vision. So this is vision debt. You know, you might be taking on vision debt when you're taking on this custom feature that your salesperson said you needed, right? Sometimes you take on vision debt if you must, but if you keep doing it, that's how you catch obsessive sales disorder. Well, the next thing that they did was they decided that they were going to share in profits or losses equally. The reason this goes in the investing in the vision quadrant is because this is important for the vision that they would never take charity, but it wasn't good for short-term survival because honestly, they didn't know if they were going to make a profit or a loss. So this is where they were investing in the vision. You might be investing in the vision if you're refactoring code for a few months, or if you're doing user research, where it's good for the vision, but not necessarily good for survival. And then they did some things in the easy decisions or ideal quadrant, right? These are the easy decisions we make, but we can't always stick only to this quadrant. So in this quadrant, they were doing things like paying everyday wages, which was good for vision and survival. Not giving or taking credit, again, good for both vision and survival. And then over time, as they were earning more money, they started to invest in education for women. This was more investing in the vision. So this is how they were balancing all these features and functionality across the different quadrants. So now we've talked about vision, strategy, how do you translate it into priorities, balancing long-term against short-term. Now let's look at how do you do your execution and measurement in this hypothesis-driven way. In the case of Lidget, right, they could measure so many different metrics, revenues, market share, customer reviews. All of these are important. When I interviewed the president of Lidget, it's not that they ignore these metrics. Yes, they're important, but these are not the main metrics by which they measure progress. They have this clarity, this incredible clarity on how they measure progress. And that's by the number of women to whom they've given financial independence. That was their hypothesis. Right? All along, everything that they do, their hypothesis is, if we run this experiment, in this case, the whole model of Lidget, then we're able to give financial independence to women because this model allows them to earn a dignified living. And so you write such a hypothesis, and then you can measure, okay, so how many women are we actually giving financial independence to? And this is how Lidget has built a radical product. Puppetums are their radical product that systematically translates a vision for change into reality. And this is how they've given financial independence to over 45,000 women. So your key takeaway is that you can engineer change very systematically. You can be vision-driven, and which means that, yes, you still iterate. Iteration is still important, but your iterations can be driven by this clarity of vision and strategy. And so this means let's keep the speed that we have using agile, lean, etc. Let's keep that speed, but let's add direction to it. And that's where you can use radical product thinking to add direction to your speed. And this is how you align your teams and you create alignment across your organization. And as product people, this is how we can spread our influence and thinking across the organization. And so with that, if you'd like to learn more, you can get the Radical Product Thinking book. We actually already sold out at the library. We were doing a book signing earlier, but you can get the book anywhere books are sold. You can get the free toolkit on radicalproduct.com. If I don't get to all of your questions, but we have a healthy amount of time today to be able to answer questions too, You can also message me on LinkedIn because I always love to both hear from you and also hear your stories of how you're creating change. And lastly, you can get the Radical Product Thinking certification. And the next session starts on October 25th. And this QR code also gives you a link to both the visioning course and the rest of the badges for earning strategy, prioritization, execution and measurement, and culture badges so that you get your Radical Product Thinking certification. And so with that, I would love to get your questions, and we'll have mics coming to you so that I can hear you. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So how do you kind of handle short-term, thank you. How do you kind of handle short-term failures in your product and manage how it does not affect your long-term radical vision? For example, in your example of legit Papad itself, COVID happens and they're not able to go out and the women are not able to, like sell and get their daily wages. That's a short-term effect of some macroeconomical factor. So it should not impact your long-term radical vision. How do you manage such situations?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that your vision should be capable of changing over time. So in fact, every 6 months, at the very least, or every year at the very, very least, we should be looking at our vision because markets change, situations change. We have to be able to look at our vision and say, is this still valid? So the question is then, how do you make sure that we're able to continue changing and take this hypothesis-driven approach so that we can incorporate failures along the way? So what I've found is it's really important to be able to, instead of just looking at it as a failure, look at everything as a hypothesis and say, okay, this hypothesis turned out to not be valid. And so what have we learned from it? So even your vision, even your strategy, you can look at every element of the fill in the blanks or every element of your strategy. You look at that as a hypothesis. And if you discover that you were wrong on something, what we do is we then point to our vision statement or to our strategy and we say, this is where we were wrong, what we learned, and here's what we're going to do instead. And so by doing this, we avoid the disease pivotitis. Because now every pivot that we take, we're taking it with gravitas. We're not just making the whole team feel like this is whiplash, like we're just switching directions. There's this clarity of what did we learn from that experiment, and now we're going to do something different because of that experiment. Taking this approach, by the way, also creates psychological safety in the team because you're now looking at it as a hypothesis and what have we learned from it. So by doing this, you're preventing a loss of momentum. It's not just a failure. You're bringing everyone with you saying this is what we learned and what we're going to do next. Thank you for that. Other questions?
Going? I was just curious if the ordering that you had, where you had to start with your vision and end with things, could you do it in a different order? For example, get metrics to help you understand what your priority would look for next.
Great question. Okay, so, it is not even though I show this as different elements of radical product thinking and these 5 separate elements, and I today talked about it in this step-by-step way, it's not necessarily a linear process. So if you can imagine for a moment in your head lines going back and forth from these different elements, because you might discover along the way that you need to change some things and go back to your vision, or you're executing and you go back to your strategy, etc. Right? So it's not a linear process. You go back and forth. But imagine for a moment that you took away the clarity of those 5 elements. Now you have these lines going back and forth, and that looks like chaos. So that's one part of it, that it's not linear. You can start at different points. The second part of your question was, you said, what if we start with metrics so that we can figure out, using metrics, what should our priorities be? The one danger with that, right, is when we use just a data-driven approach without a clarity of what is our vision and what's the change, very often that data can lead us astray. And I'm going to give you an example. This is actually an organization that I was doing consulting for. They have a product that is still finding product market fit, but there are avid users of this product. If we focused on the metrics based on current product usage, what we would be catering for is those early adopters who are super tech savvy and know how to use this. They're the mavericks. If we built the product for them, we would be missing out on the large group that we actually want to target, who are actually the less tech savvy users. That's where our product success truly lies. Right? And so we can't just focus on metrics. If we know what is our vision, the next step is our strategy, where we say, okay, who are the personas we have to target? And what is their actual pain point? I might then do qualitative user research to then have a clear strategy. But I would still take a hypothesis-driven approach. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we need to get back on track. So.
More later then, ask me on LinkedIn or find me afterwards. Thank you.